My guest has visited a lot of different churches. He's interviewed over 100 people on his channel about the Christian faith. And for the last 8 months, he's been attending an Episcopal church. What drew him in? What attracted him to the particular parish that he attends? Join me and my guest, Gospel Simplicity or Austin, as we talk about the Episcopal Church, what he's come to appreciate, what he thinks our growing edges are. He's known too for asking his interviewees at the end, what is the gospel? And I get to be the first person to put that question to him. I pray that God blesses your watching or listening to this video, and that it might be a help to you as you come to know the saving grace of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Hello and welcome to All Things Necessary, a podcast about the Christian life, especially as expressed through the Episcopal Church and Anglicanism. And I am here with Austin, who has a channel here on YouTube called Gospel Simplicity. So welcome to you, Austin.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
And so today we're going to chat a bit about Austin's channel and his kind of journey towards the Episcopal Church and some other topics related to things that Austin often speaks about on his channel. But Austin, just for those who maybe aren't familiar with who you are or your channel, Gospel Simplicity, just tell us a bit about yourself and your channel.
Yeah. And thanks again for having me. Glad to be here. So as far as my channel goes, the name is often pointed out to me as being somewhat ironic because I tend to cover a bit complex topics, but the basic journey of the channel has been that I've sought to express ideas about theology as I've grown and developed over time. And that has led me down different paths. It started right before I went to Bible college for my undergrad, and then has continued, years since then. But basically, these days, I primarily look at church history with the goal of sharing beauty, truth, and goodness in the Christian tradition across a wide spread of backgrounds. So I often host people who are Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, etc., to talk about the things we have in common, the things we differ on, and hopefully that the audience can kind of get something out of that and have the experience I've had, which is to find that in all the messiness of the church, there's a lot of things that are good, true, and beautiful there as well.
Yeah, that's great. And I know you've had, do you even know how many different people you've interviewed at this point? Have you kept a count?
It's over 100. I know I'm close to 600 videos total, but not all of those are interviews and some are clips. But over 100 people have been interviewed. I know that.
And I know as some of the work you've done on your channel, you've also visited quite a few churches. I know I watched a really fascinating video where you attended a Catholic megachurch, and that's been part of your journey as well as visiting churches.
Yeah, so that's one of the first things that really took off on the channel was just going to these different churches and touring them, talking to people and asking maybe like the silly questions that other people would be too afraid to ask, but I could ask for them and wasn't scared to ask. So, having grown up in kind of an evangelical, non-denominational setting, the first time I went into like a really ornate Catholic church, I'm just asking like, why is that there? Why are you facing that way? What's the deal with that or that? And along the way, you actually learn a lot about a church's theology just by how they set up a building and what they kind of prioritize. And there's often so much more detail and thought put into these things, especially in like really old historic churches, than I would have ever realized.
Yeah. That makes me think of a time I brought some, I've done a lot of campus ministry and brought some students to St. Louis Cathedral that's in New Orleans in the French Quarter. And one of the students grew up, I'm not sure what, but fairly low church. And I guess had never walked into a church that had a crucifix in it. And they had a fairly large one. And she just was like instantly overwhelmed with like emotion about thinking of Christ's offering for us. And yeah, it's just something, as somebody who's been exposed to a lot of churches, you don't think about that. But yeah, there are a lot of questions one might have if you've never stepped foot in a church that looks different than what you've grown up in. How many churches do you think you've visited at this point?
Ooh. I've visited a lot, just on my own, but as far as doing videos, not a ton. I'd probably say somewhere around a dozen. They tend to be the most difficult videos to make. I need someone else to film them usually as I'm walking around through it. They take a long time to edit as well as set up, but they are some of my favorite to do. I've gotten to do a couple like really pretty old Catholic churches, including the Baltimore Basilica, which was the first. They're very technical on this. How do they say it? America's first cathedral, because the one in New Orleans is older, but it wasn't in America when it was built. Whereas the one in Baltimore was built for, the United States of America.
Louisiana.
Yeah, that's their very technical kind of claim to fame. But I've gotten to do a fair few that are decently representative Catholic, Orthodox. I've done fewer Protestant ones, though I would like to maybe do a few more of those.
Okay. And so in this journey, I know on your channel you've recently expressed that you've been attending an Episcopal church.
Mhm.
And I would just love for you to share a bit about your journey to the Episcopal Church.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it somewhat brief, and then we can kind of expand into any of this that
Yeah.
you'd like. But basically, grew up non-denominational, evangelical, kind of like seeker-sensitive, megachurch type of environment. And until I was about 18, I think I'd only ever been to like 2 other churches, like for a single Sunday. Um, I was there every week, multiple times a week. My mom was on staff, so that was kind of my whole world and my whole picture of what the church looked like.
Yeah.
I moved to Chicago for college, and at that point, kind of looking for new churches, but went into a similar lane. But while I was in college, I got really interested in church history, and that kind of influenced where my channel went. And all of a sudden, by nature of the videos I was making, I was having a lot of really smart Catholic and Orthodox people comment on my stuff and ask me questions I'd really never considered. Church history wasn't something I'd thought about much, neither was kind of more liturgical expressions of church worship. And so all of a sudden, I was just very curious and wanted to get a sense of this. Went through a period of real like existential angst over whether I needed to become Catholic or Orthodox. Ended up not doing that, but after college, I got married, and for a while, we kind of stayed in the non-denominational world. But I'd always had, or not always, but for the past couple of years at that point, had been drawn towards more liturgical worship. But it wasn't really my wife's cup of tea, or at least she didn't think it would be, until
Yeah.
one day we were on vacation, and we were in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And it was a Sunday. We were like, hey, we should find a church somewhere. We saw there was this Episcopal church that looked really pretty. We went in there. And to my surprise, I'd taken Eliza, my wife, on a lot of kind of random church adventures, shall we say, to Catholic Orthodox services. And none of them had ever really been like something that gripped her. But she loved it. And
Yeah.
so for me, that was big because it was a place that we both enjoyed and could potentially kind of find a home. So when we got back to Baltimore, where we live, there had been an Episcopal church that we'd driven past many times, just right on the highway. And it always looked so beautiful. It's an old stone church. And we said, maybe we should give that a try. And we did, and we loved it. And we just kind of kept going.
That's great. That's great. So I just got to say then, welcome to the Episcopal Church. This is one of, I think, our best memes.
I like it.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, so you mentioned like the liturgy and the service and stuff like that, the beauty of the outside of the building. And so you landed in a particular church that's near you. So what is it about the particular church you've been attending that made you want to stick with it?
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways I think I could approach this, be it like theologically, personally, liturgically. I'll maybe try to touch on a couple different aspects of that. But the specific church that we landed in, there was a couple of things that really stood out to me. I mean, one thing that I'd always been kind of told about, not just the Episcopal Church, but I had this conception of any mainline church would be that they were just like spiritually dead, like social clubs, is what I was told, having never been in them. And I was delighted to find when I got there just a real care for preaching the gospel and also for helping people grow spiritually and kind of holistically. Our priest at the church actually is someone who has a PhD in theology and in psychology and kind of weds those two things really beautifully, I think.
Wow.
So that kind of care for that, I think, was one layer. But the things that you notice, I think, a bit more quickly is just the life of the church. And it's I don't know how to describe it. It's kind of like a wonderfully chaotic church in some ways. So there's like a beautiful liturgy, wonderful choir and organist, and like all of that is done with real care and to do it well. And then you get to the passing of the peace, and it's a church that like everyone has to say hi to everyone, and it's kind of just like this beautiful chaos. But they really make you feel at home. The coffee hour, everyone's so welcoming and warm, and we are younger than most of the people there, and so there's that kind of aspect of like, whoa, we're so glad you're here. But we found the church also to be doing a ton for the community and for the congregation to really reflect the makeup of the community. It's a very diverse congregation. Those are things that we just really valued, to see a church that was making a difference, like a kind of church that if it closed its doors, it feels like the community would miss it, even for the people who don't go there, which I think is a good kind of litmus test for the church. And then there's things theologically that have been helpful for us, on my journey of looking into Catholicism and Orthodoxy. questions of like certainty were big things, and whether, the church is kind of restricted to one body. And I find the Episcopal Church's kind of just openness to being able to say we hold a few things, but not everything really tightly, has been beautiful to me and theologically helpful. And then I would say on a personal level, my wife and I have just loved the Book of Common Prayer and the way that's kind of shaped our kind of daily rituals.
Yeah, yeah. So a few of the things that I'm hearing and what you're sharing are things that through various trainings and stuff I've heard are important. You mentioned the church doing things like its worship and the music well, right? Like it's putting its best foot forward whenever it gathers. And then, the other thing that's kind of makes me chuckle is you talk about the passing of the peace and everybody says hi to everybody, because that's often a point of almost like discourse, is like how vibrant should a passing of the peace be? Because you've got people who are kind of like introverts on one side who are like, I don't want anybody to talk to me or notice that I'm here, onto people like yourself who sounds like you like a good fulsome passing of the peace.
The funny thing about that is my wife and I are both very much introverts. And that's actually one thing that she likes about the church is she mentions like, it's quiet. I feel like I can sit there and be reflective. But there is something about, I don't know, the passing of the peace that both of us have just enjoyed, where it feels genuine. Like everyone's just really excited to see you. And there is just like slight element of chaos and just seeing how happy everyone is to see one another. We have a new priest there, and I have no idea, his opinions on the way it's done. He often has to kind of like herd people back, like, okay, we're done, this is over. But I have a feeling like if he wanted it to be more solemn, Father Mario is wonderful. I just don't think he could achieve that. Like, I think the congregation is like, this is who we are and this is how we're doing it. And there's just something, I don't know, refreshing about that. It's so not who I am, but there's something fun about that to me.
Oh yeah, I've definitely been that clergy person trying to wrangle everybody back in their pews. It's hard. It's like when you hear the piano playing, get back to your seats, and then it's almost like, Phil, don't go say hi to another person. Phil, the music's playing. Sit down. I'm wondering then what advice you would have to somebody who's considering visiting an Episcopal church, or is maybe even like on the fence about it.
Yeah, I guess a couple things. One thing I have to recognize, and I touched on this a little, is like I had formed somehow a vision of what the Episcopal Church or any mainline church would look like, again, without ever having been in one. And that was just totally unfair. And it surprises me because I often try to guard against that type of thing. But I think, have that ability to maybe just check expectations at the door a little bit and just see, like, just be open to what it is. And also recognize that like every church is different. And so, there's like multiple Episcopal churches in this town, and I'm sure you'll get a bit different flavor at each of them. So allow for the stereotype to not inform kind of what you experience, but also allow what you experience not to be generalized to every church. Like maybe a specific one might not be your cup of tea. But I think the biggest thing would be like, just give it a try. I mean, there's not, especially in the Episcopal Church, there's like not much pressure,
Right. Yeah.
I think if you show up, like it's gonna be okay. Like even if you have the worst hour and a half of your life, which you're not going to, like you're really gonna be fine at the end. And yeah, I mean, so I think give it a try. If you're like me, you went in and it's like your first liturgical service, flip through the booklet a little bit and try to get a sense of it. We were very lucky, again, kind of a nice mix. I talked about like the chaos of the like extroverted nature of it. But on our first experience at St. Bartholomew's, where we go, there was just a really nice woman who saw we were new and like very quietly asked like, do we have any questions? And kind of gave us a sense of like, by the way, like people might stand or kneel at this point, like do whatever you want, totally up to you. And we've, at the different Episcopal churches we've gone to, like I haven't run into anyone who's like super, I don't know, super concerned that you're doing everything right. They care about the liturgy, but I've always experienced it to be a very welcoming place. Even down to like, we'll joke like, what are we going to wear? And we talk about how like, it's St. B's, like everyone's just so nice there. No one's going to judge you. That might not be the case everywhere, but that's what we found.
Yeah. I think that would be fairly common, that most Episcopal churches would be thrilled that you're there.
Yeah.
I know, like, for our church on the website, I try to give people some sense of what you might see, but you can kind of wear whatever. And even that I need to update because now it is a little bit more mixed. But yeah, I mean, I know for our guests too, there's a lot of concern because you'll see some people, but not everybody, say bowing at the name of Jesus or crossing themselves at certain points of the liturgy or genuflecting when they come out of the pew. And there's often questions like, well, how do I know what in it? Yeah, it's just relax. Like, that's kind of a point of personal piety. Nobody's really looking at you to figure out if you're doing it all right or not. And that's okay. And that's amazing that it's St. Bartholomew's, because happy feast of St.
Yeah.
Bartholomew to you and
Yeah. I thought
yours.
about that on the recording of this. It's a good day for it.
It is a good day. That's right. Who of the apostles, I mean, just some really great depictions of him carrying his skin around, which is always fun.
Yeah. And be ready for that kind of stuff too.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, interesting stained glass, all sorts of things. You've spoken some about the positive things that drew you and your wife into the Episcopal Church. What do you think some of the growing edges are for the Episcopal Church, either kind of denominationally or what local churches might do better as far as welcoming people in and being a presence for the gospel?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I guess I could take it in a couple different ways. I think one thing, I mentioned like it's St. B's, no one's going to judge you. And I love that about it. And it's very much like, come as you are. And we're glad you're here. And I think that's all really wonderful. I don't want to kind of denigrate any of that. I
Right.
think at times the Episcopal Church, and this is kind of a, generalization, again, not going to be true in every case,
Yeah.
but can be really focused on like a hyper awareness of we're not going to have like a toxic religiosity, or we're not going to be overly controlling. We're not going to be too dogmatic on anything. And I think
And
there's a lot of good impulses there. But I think sometimes the Episcopal Church can get into a place of defining itself negatively. Like there's all of these toxic Christianities out there, and we're not that. So if
right.
you're deconstructing from that, come here. And I think it's great, like that people who are deconstructing from their faith, whatever that looked like growing up, can have a place to continue to practice Christianity in a way that's meaningful for them and that doesn't feel as high control or feel like it has some of those negative aspects. Again, that's all good. I think just any organization, it behooves it to have some type of positive identity too. Like,
Mhm.
we're not just, we're not that, we're not all those bad things that Christianity has been in certain instances, but we're also this. And I think whatever that this is, would be good for it to be defined by the gospel, however we want to define that. We can talk about that in a bit, I suppose. But I think sometimes there's so much concern to say like we're not a bad form of Christianity, but that we also want to say like this is Christianity still. Like that is still why we're here. This isn't, just for helping the community or this or that, which are all good things. But I think having a sense of this is who we are is a just a helpful part of what you're doing there. And I guess, at a more, I, at a different level would be when like a young person comes in, it can be like a bit of a surprise or a bit of an exciting thing. And I think there is an aspect of, just generally congregations seem to skew older, which isn't bad. Like we want it to be a place for all people.
Yeah.
But I think, finding ways to connect with people in a way that doesn't feel like hokey. But just
Yeah.
in this makes sense, and we're glad you're here, but we're not also like shocked that you showed up. I think you could kind of shade into an area where like you're so excited and you're like, why on earth would you show up here? I think a little bit of a sense of like, oh yeah, we're glad you're here. Like that totally makes sense that you'd come, and let us know what we can do. So those are a few things that come to mind. I'm sure we could get into other things, but
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if you've ever heard of, I think I've heard it put a couple different ways, that when new people come in, that the older congregation kind of gets that vampire stare. You ever heard that?
I
'Cause
haven't heard that.
it's fresh blood. You know what I mean?
Nice. Yeah.
And yeah, it can be a little over the top. I mean, I've been in church, like I did campus ministry at a university and was attending a church, and our pastor challenged us to invite somebody new to church. So I did. And my friend worked at a bakery, and he was up at like 3:30 every morning to make croissant dough and roll out croissants. And somebody in the church, when he said what he did, and this was his first time there, was like, Wouldn't it be wonderful if we started a baking ministry here at the church? And you might guess he never came back, because who wants to get up and roll out the croissant dough one more day?
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. And,
That-
I mean, this might be a little too in the weeds, but I think for all of the, things that were maybe unhelpful in the non-denominational world, which I still have a lot of love for, honestly. But I think they can be really good about like being efficient in things of like, not every time someone says we need to start a new ministry means we need to start a new ministry. Like if you're a congregation of 100 people, you don't need 100 ministries. It's
No.
just going to burn everyone out. It's not efficient. And so I think having, just more clear ways of like, hey, if you want to get involved, here are like 3 things that we really prioritize here versus like,
Yeah.
oh, here's 100 different things you could do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if it's somebody's first time there, unless they're asking you, how do I get involved? Like, you probably don't want them to, you probably shouldn't try to set them up with running a ministry the first day they show up. Yeah. To your first point in that, the importance of the Episcopal Church not defining itself negatively against other denominations. I think that's true. I think too often we do default to like, well, we're not fundamentalists. We're not like the mega churches. We're not this, that, and the other. And you kind of wonder, well, what is the positive content? And I think this relates to you. I don't remember if it was in this or when we chatted to set this up about kind of the big tent nature of the Episcopal Church. And I think for that, what people can lose sight of is like, well, to have a big tent, we still need some poles to hold everything up and some guy lines to like, right, make sure that the big tent is upright and has room for everybody. And I do think as the Episcopal Church, we could do a better job of talking about what are those poles and guy lines that keep the big tent up. And I would really hope we could make Jesus Christ and salvation through him, the main pole that we're all gathering under. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I guess the flip side of defining itself negatively was finding something to define itself positively by. And I think, that's probably the harder part. I think a lot of people can say, oh yeah, we shouldn't define ourselves negatively just because inherently that sounds, I don't know, unfortunate. Like we want to be for something. And it's then just determining what is that thing that we are for. And there's a lot of good things, but I think it's helpful to find like the thing. It's good to serve the community. It's good to, care about our nation and the direction it's going or whatnot. Like it's good to care for vulnerable people. All of these things, like all of that is good stuff. But what is it that makes the Episcopal Church Episcopal and church?
Yeah, I do think the way I sometimes hear this question put to us, and this is usually kind of like in clergy training things, trying to help us get to like what is our particular church's, say, mission or vision, is kind of like what makes us different from the Rotary Club or something.
Yeah.
And I do think and I don't think this is unique for the Episcopal Church. I was United Methodist for a time, but I do think my hunch is probably it's more likely in mainline churches than not that answering that question of what differentiates us from the Rotary Club or just kind of a social venture can be a little bit hard and takes some teaching in the church to get back to that kind of unique God-given mission that the church has.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll say, just from my world, like that was also a question that the non-denominational church had to answer, but it was just a different perspective. I think like often, it might be what separates the mainline church from like organizations for social good, or for, social community. And I think in the non-denominational church, there was often so much emphasis on how do we make this cool? How do we make this exciting? And how do we make this a place where like people can make friends and get plugged into community? But it was like, okay, those are all good things, but like, we're still not going to be the coolest thing you can do on a Sunday. Like, I hate to break it to you, but there's just more exciting things to do if that's your only criteria, right? And if you're just looking to make friends, I mean, church is pretty good at that, I suppose, but there are other ways to make friends. And so I think, this is a problem that everyone has, and every organization, every YouTube channel has this, right? It's really easy to build a following based on, hey, let's bash this thing. We're not that. And it's easy to motivate people around that, but it's often not the healthiest way to build a community because, anger might excite people for a bit of we're not that, but ultimately we want to find something that we are for. And I'm not saying that the Episcopal Church is defined by anger there, but just that general impulse of what you're not can lead to unfortunate places, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting to hear you talk about from that mega church world about, trying to make church cool. And no matter how good churches get at that, there's probably going to be something cooler. And why that statement interests me is this summer I went to a young adult and campus ministry conference in St. Louis, and it was done jointly by the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. And more than once, different people said something to the effect of, young people don't want traditional liturgical churches anymore. So we got to do something different. And it was things like, having young adult ministries that maybe go on a hike together and do a Bible study somewhere on the way. Or, they meet at a pub or a coffee shop and kind of have a more informal time of hanging out and maybe singing some songs together in prayer. And what struck me as odd about hearing that more than once is, well, my church is very traditional liturgically, and we have younger people coming, more younger people showing up. Those are most of our new guests and new growth over the last 2.5 years. And I met at least one other church that felt the same way. We're a very liturgical church. There's a college in town, and we're seeing young people come, not in spite of the liturgical stuff, but because of it. And that's kind of what I hear a bit in your story as well, right? That the liturgy and the beauty of it was part of what attracted you to the particular church you go to.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts on this. So one thing I think that's just always helpful for all of us to keep in mind is that, like, anytime someone says young people like this or don't like this, it's probably only a half truth, because young people, like all other people, have various interests and tastes and things. And so I always chuckle a little bit when people like feel like they've honed in on, all young people like liturgy or all young people like contemporary services. Like, it's just like non-young people. Some like liturgy and some like contemporary things. And I think we like to think that, maybe the reason young people aren't coming is because of a stylistic thing. And that just feels like a little too easy to me, because there's young people that like that type of style. On the other hand, when I was at Moody, where I did my undergrad, I remember talking with some people, and there was a big trend of people who grew up evangelical, who then went into Anglican churches, and they were really interested in liturgy. And all of their parents were baffled by this, because they all grew up in liturgical churches and then found out, in the 90s or in the early 2000s, oh, there's this seeker sensitive movement, and church can have electric guitars, and it's really fun and it's cool. And I think there's probably an element of this being like somewhat cyclical, that what you haven't experienced seems novel and interesting. And that's not to say that all forms are equally good or valid or whatnot. But I do think there is just an aspect of, oh, this is different. And I think a lot of people, I think one thing that is true for a lot of young people, although not, universally, is that there's this process of like differentiation from your parents of, I grew up this, and now I'm figuring out who I am as a person. And there's this process of kind of like owning whatever that is that you are. And so for a lot of people, that looks like, hey, maybe I'm going to take up opinions very different than my parents. If my parents were really conservative, I'm going to go to college and be more liberal, or maybe vice versa. Because you want to try to, push at the boundaries a little bit and see what that looks like. And I think in terms of church and in faith, there's this sense of, I was handed on a faith, and maybe it's worked, maybe it hasn't worked for me. Maybe I'm trying to figure out what it even means for me particularly. And of course, there's like individualistic downsides to that, but I also just think it's a natural part of growing up. And so some of that might look like I'm going to try a different church, and that might be more liturgical, it might be less liturgical. Other ways, it might just look like I'm going to ask new questions and try to unearth this a bit myself. And so, I think there's a lot of dynamics that go on there, but I'd be wary of saying either one is like a silver bullet, because I think young people, like other people, are kind of varied. Although I will say one trend in the liturgy that I think is helpful is that, like, my generation and those younger than me, we've grown up with an insane amount of people advertising to us every second of every day. And there is something about something that's not so like tailored to us. It's like, oh, like you're just doing your thing. Like that's kind of cool. Versus like you're overtly catering to me, because everyone else is catering to me. Like everyone wants to get young people's interest. So sometimes there's something in being different in that way.
Yeah, I think that last point is really important, that what I appreciate about the liturgy is that it isn't tailored to me. And I think other people connect with it for the same reason, is that it's something you're invited to participate in and be a part of, right? And so in that way, it's harder to turn it into kind of like a consumer experience, right? Where it's something that's done primarily for the congregation to have a particular experience or reaction to it. I mean, I was reminded of this just this past weekend. I was at a meeting with some other clergy and some consultants about an initiative we're working on, and one of the consultants comes from a different tradition and kept calling it a worship experience instead of just worship or the liturgy. And I think that points to something. Not that we shouldn't have experiences in worship, but I do think there's a way that if you start thinking of it as a worship experience, I mean, well, whose experience? Like, right? Is this primarily about creating a kind of environment where the people in the congregation have a particular emotional response to what's happening? Or is this something we're doing together that's offered up to God? Or ideally, it's something that kind of weds the two, right? Like, like we are oriented together to worship God, and that as we gather, we're aware of that. And I think that other thing you said about not saying one thing about all young people is so important too. I do think we're always looking for that silver bullet or magic growth beans. And while most of our growth has been with people under 40, the kind of more charismatic Pentecostal megachurch in town has way more young people than we do. And that's fine. I mean, and I think that's something I would hope the Episcopal Church and other mainline churches could embrace, instead of like fighting with one another about what's the silver bullet we all need to use, is that for us to be faithful to the gospel, it is possible to do the same liturgy out of the Book of Common Prayer with different expressions to reach who we think God has called us to.
Yeah, I think there's good layers to that, of having a certain level of flexibility both within your own tradition and also being able to say, like, as much as, we might love the Episcopal Church and we think it can reach like a ton of people, it's a big tent, right? There
Yeah.
might be people at the end of the day who say, like, thanks, but no thanks. Like this other
Yep.
thing just makes more sense to me. And I think being able to have an openness to saying, like, hey, God's at work beyond my church. And I mean,
Yes.
that it seems like that in a way should be easier for Episcopalians than most people, right? But I think there is, we all want our preferred way of doing things to win out in the end, and we want what works for us to work for everyone, and that's super natural, and I get it. But yeah, I think just having that openness to saying, you know what, like maybe people are finding this somewhere else, and that's okay. Like maybe I wish it was different, this or that. Like, yeah, sure, but at the end of the day, like I don't get to dictate where everyone goes to church. I don't get to dictate everyone's preference, and maybe that will be good for someone for a season, and then in a different season they're going to be like, hey, I can't muster up the energy I needed for that Pentecostal service. I'm exhausted with my kids and all of this, and I just need something I can do each day that doesn't take a ton from me, but I'm able to like sit down and do morning devotions for families or something, and that's what's carrying me through this
Yeah.
new season of life, and say, like, great.
That's right. I want to shift now to some about the work of your channel, because with having people on from all these different traditions, you mentioned you're helping people find goodness, truth, and beauty in the Christian faith in a broad spectrum of what Christianity is. And one of the phrases I know you've used in some of your videos, and we chatted a bit about it, is that as a person is trying to figure out where to land as a Christian, that they can develop what's called ecclesial anxiety. And so to start us off on that, what is ecclesial anxiety?
Oh, I love this question. Yes. So, I mean, anxiety in general is a certain like fear over a potential outcome happening,
Okay.
a perceived like negative experience that could happen, right? And then we could boil that down a layer. That's not like a super clinical definition, but it'll work for now. To what we call like epistemic anxiety, which is anxiety or fear based on a perceived sense of believing the wrong thing or thinking the wrong thing. So it's just anxiety about epistemology, which is knowledge, right? How we know things. And that
Yeah.
could look like someone being really anxious about, like, can I know anything at all? Are we living in a simulation? Like that type of thing, right? Ecclesial anxiety I see as like the smallest of the nesting dolls going down here, or the concentric circles, where people have this fear over being in or discerning which is the right church. And I think this is often exacerbated by a sense that there is a one true church outside of which there is no salvation. Because if we think about anxiety generally, if it's based upon a perceived sense of risk, the more that we
Mhm.
heighten that sense of risk, the greater the anxiety is going to go up. So if you say like, hey, all churches are more or less the same, pick whichever one you like, the risk is going to be pretty low. So you're probably not going to be
Yeah.
too anxious about finding the right one,
Right.
depending on your just kind of personal makeup and how anxious you get over most things. But if the question of which church is the true church, it has like eternal stakes, right? Outside of this, there is no salvation. And there's a lot of people talking in this kind of way online. And it's not hard to find that type of language in the history of the church. So it's not, inconceivable that someone would say something like that, even if I think there's problems with it.
Mhm.
But if you're consuming a lot of content that's telling you that, then all of a sudden this question of which church to join gets really scary for people. And I talk to people all the time who come to me who are spending hours and hours online, researching debates about really technical things of church history or theology, like the filioque, like whether the Father or whether the Spirit proceeds from the Father alone or the Father and the Son, which was a big debate between the East and the West, and
Yeah.
is not something, your average 25-year-old working in, I don't know, like electrical engineering during the week is going to be able to figure out on his weekends or something. But if you think like the salvation of my soul depends on getting this right, and you're constantly consuming debates from one side or the other, and everyone's telling you this side's going to hell, this side's going to hell, at its worst,
Yeah.
then that's really scary, and that causes something that I call ecclesial anxiety, which, for the record, isn't like a clinical term, isn't
Right.
even like that much of a real word. It's a YouTube word for now, but I think it's helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think it's important to know that that is a growing phenomenon among some young people. Again, we're not speaking for all young people, but it does map onto some of my experience here being in campus ministry. That certainly that question of should I be Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant is a much more lively question than when I was a student 20 years ago, or even doing campus ministry, say 10 years ago, at least with the kinds of students I was connecting with. I mean, maybe it was happening just not in the small slice of the student population I was seeing. And at least for me, it's been a wonderful growing edge to have to come back to some things that I didn't really think very hardly about, just because it was never a lively question for me or anyone else. And yeah, certainly if somebody were to ask me to share my understanding of the Holy Spirit's procession from the Father and maybe the Son, I would say, yeah, like maybe give me a week to do a little reading, because it's just not been a question. How do you think your channel helps people break through ecclesial anxiety?
Yeah, and this is a question I have to ask myself a lot, because I recognize, depending on how my channel is received or the content is consumed, it can be a source of heightened ecclesial anxiety for people.
Yeah.
And I say this because one of the things I'm committed to is allowing people from across the Christian tradition to speak, from their perspective and present the best of what their tradition has to offer. And I've always been a person that really likes wide reading, multiplicity of kind of perspectives, and kind of sitting in the middle of that. It's something I enjoy, but I recognize for some people that can be really scary and maybe
Mhm.
unhelpful depending on where they're at. And so I'd tell someone, if they're in that situation, like, no need to listen to all of these voices, even that if that might seem like some good, humanistic liberal arts type of ideal. Like, you don't have to start there. But I think what I try to do in my personal content, and what I mean by that is I do interviews and then I kind of share my own perspective on things. And I do more of the latter these days. What I try to tell people is a couple of things. Like, when it comes to ecclesial anxiety, I think there's just things that, I'll talk about how we can deal with anxiety, generally speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Like, slow down. Let's understand what's happening here. Let's recognize, let's take a breath. Let's maybe like reframe this experience. Is this experience of anxiety an opportunity for greater, greater faith? That's how someone like Soren Kierkegaard kind of frames anxiety, which I think is helpful. But then there's more kind of doctrinal things that I'll get into. So I've made videos about why I think a really kind of narrow exclusivist read of no salvation outside the church just isn't helpful and makes some, I think, theological kind of missteps in terms of how salvation works. For me, salvation is primarily being joined to Christ, right? And then if you're joined to Christ, you're joined to his body, which is the church. Okay, we can go in that direction rather than making salvation something about kind of institutional affiliation. And so trying to get at the sense of risk for people, like, hey, I actually don't think this is a question of whether you're saved or not. And then walking with people through that. And one thing I like to talk to people about is, when you're in any situation where you have a lot of uncertainty, it's helpful to think about what you do know. And for me, what I always come back to is like, even if I have a ton of theological questions I don't know the answers to, and I do, there are things that I feel like I genuinely know. And that generally comes back to the character of God. Like, what do I think about God fundamentally? Because I do think that as people get into these questions, they often can like unknowingly slip into this picture of God as like, I don't know, like a theology professor who's grading their answers to a quiz. And I think it's more helpful to think about God as a good and loving father and say like, wait a second, like, let's just zoom out for a second. Does this make sense? This picture of God that you're developing, does it look like Jesus? Like, when you read the Sermon on the Mount, is it like, blessed are the theologically acute? Is it like just having that sense of perspective? Because I find we often like just lose sight of some of the main thrusts of what Jesus talked about and get into these kind of theological minutia that begin taking up all of our time. So trying to give people a sense of perspective as well as tools to use in the midst of it.
That's great. And I've sometimes wondered, as somebody who's still kind of on the outside of that kind of YouTube world, I could see where coming to this content could fuel anxiety and be really unhelpful in that way. I wonder, do you ever get the sense that maybe another reason to keep coming back to the content and keep trying to hash out who's right, does it end up being like a delay tactic from actually going to a particular church?
Yeah, so this is really good. This is all top of mind, not to plug something that doesn't exist yet, but I've almost done a book on this topic. And one of the things I talk about at the end is this idea of being faithful to imperfect churches. And I think for a lot of people, ecclesial anxiety can take them to this place where they are constantly seeking this perfect church, which kind of becomes an excuse in a way to never set down roots in any particular church. And that's just not a helpful thing. And something I talk about a lot in the book is this idea of like, okay, I'm going to assume that if you're spending hours and hours kind of spun up around questions about the church, that this, at least the initial impetus for this, was a love for the church. Like, you're doing this because you think this matters, because it's important. We don't tend to get anxious over things that, don't matter to us. I'm personally not really anxious about all the lore around Taylor Swift's new album. My wife is, right? But like, that doesn't matter to me. So like, as much as I listen to the theories, like, I'm not feeling anxious about it, but that type of thing, right? So the thing I tell people is like, let's remember, like, okay, we're doing this because we love the church, and we don't want to use our theological questions as an excuse to not be engaged in the church, just in the same way that we could ask all types of questions about what does it really mean to love our neighbor? But we would be absolutely missing the point if we just sat around and debated what it means to love our neighbor and didn't actually like engage in any type of self-sacrificial love for our neighbor, because we know enough, right? To be able to say, okay, this is good, this is bad. And likewise, like, we know enough about the church to say like, hey, I should be engaged in the life of the church, even if that church is imperfect.
Yes. I think we even see this reflected in the Gospels, where the apostles and disciples just start following Jesus, even with relatively little information about who he is or what's going to happen. And those who kind of try to figure out Jesus from a distance, right, try to make a head game out of him, tend to miss the boat. And so I think that's really great that you're working on a book to kind of help people like being faithful to imperfect churches, because they're all imperfect.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis, who expresses everything better than I do, has at the beginning of Mere Christianity a really beautiful image for this, where he talks about the church as one big house with a hallway of mere Christianity, the things that we hold in common. But he makes a lot of point to say the real action, the real life is in the rooms. Like even the worst room is better than living in the hallway. And I think it's that same idea here. Like, yeah, maybe you should have gone Methodist instead of Presbyterian. But at the end of the day, either one is a whole lot better than like scrolling YouTube on Sunday morning, right? So yeah, I think that idea of, like get in a room. That's where the fireplace is. That's where the comfy leather chairs are. Maybe the suede chair in that room is better than the leather one in that one. It's not. Leather would be better. But you know what I'm saying. Get in the room.
That's right. Get in the room. And you know what? If you land in a church and you're there for even a few months or a few years, I mean, sunk cost fallacy, like just because you've put a few years in and you've realized, well, maybe this isn't the room for me. I mean, you can try out another one. Plenty of that.
And I think I tell people similar things when it comes to like their devotional life. Like I'll have people tell me like, oh, should I use the Book of Common Prayer? Should I pray the Jesus prayer? What about the rosary or this or that? It's like, I'm pretty sure saints have been made with all of these. Like, just pick one and stick with it for a bit. And I think we have this sense sometimes with ecclesial anxiety or with devotions that, this is this really important question. And once I figure it out, this is going to kind of jumpstart my spiritual life because it's been a bit dead, but that's okay. I'm in this holding pattern right now. It's like, no, like take ownership over this and just like engage with something for an extended period of time. You're not signing your life away. But I do think sometimes we are too apt. Like we go to one liturgy, we, pray the hours, or, we do the morning devotion or whatever it is. We engage in some devotional exercise and like, we don't feel like a different person after a day or a week. So we give up on it and try another one. It's like, I'm pretty sure any of these will work. Like just stick with it for a bit.
Yeah, I think it's important that if one is not really familiar with the lives of any saints or even kind of pivotal figures in Christian faith, most of them have periods of spiritual kind of deadness, even in the midst of them doing really good work. I mean, you find that in writings from Desert Fathers, from mystics. I mean, somebody like John Wesley too. You see that they went through periods too where they were anxious about their relationship with God. They felt like things were spiritually dead. And I think what sets them apart from others that we don't know about is that they stuck with what was in front of them. They just kept at it. You talked about, keeping it for a week. That's where I try to tell people that spiritual disciplines are a lot like physical exercise. If you haven't been running and you go out and try to just like get like a quick 3-4 miles in, it's probably going to feel terrible. And even after a few days, it might not feel like you're improving at all. But that doesn't mean that running's like not good for you and you need to switch and try something else, right? Like you got to stick with it for its like fruit to start yielding in you. So too with spiritual disciplines.
Yeah. And I think just continuing on that metaphor, I've been guilty of this in my own life of like, hey, I want to like put on some muscle, or I want to work out more, but should I do free weight? Should I do machines? Should I do like body weight exercises? And you like put off doing any exercise because you're looking for the perfect one. It's like, my guy, any of these are going to work. Like, trust me. Just pick one and do it. It's all better than watching YouTube videos about it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Like you could spend your whole life watching exercise YouTube videos, but if you're not also working out, you're not going to see any gains. So
yeah, and that's not to say that like in time you might learn your body a bit more and find like, oh, this works better for me. And so too with the church. Like you might, engage in one devotion, for like a year, and you find, yeah, this does yield fruit for me, but because of my own just personality, maybe my attention span, maybe, the way I learn best, maybe like this thing is actually better for me than this thing. But you can only find that if you actually put in the time for a while and you develop like some skill. Like it takes, working out to know that, hey, maybe this works for me better than that. But as long as you're just kind of on the couch watching the video, you're not going to know. And same with the spiritual life, I think. Like maybe in time you find that Lectio Divina just doesn't work for you because your mind wanders too much or something.
Right.
Like, okay, but in doing that, you'll learn something about yourself, you'll still grow, and maybe you'll kind of find, okay, maybe this would work better for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's important too for anybody who's not familiar with a liturgical church in getting into that the liturgy we use Sunday after Sunday does have a bit of a learning curve, and it'll take more than 1 or 2 Sundays to be able to fully enter into what it is without just kind of being confused or overwhelmed about like what page are we on, if it's using the Book of Common Prayer, like, or even the hymnal, so I'll say, like, for me, one of the biggest learning curves, like in the first month of being an Episcopalian, was the service music section of the hymnal and then the rest of it. So if you've never picked up an Episcopal hymnal, the service music has an S in front of it, and then the numeration starts over, and like just even finding stuff in the hymnal was really like off-putting for a few weeks because it's kind of an odd, I think, editorial choice. But yeah, you got to like stick with it.
Yeah, you do. And that is my one and only complaint with the not really. But I was going to say that at St. Peter's they do change the like you can maybe tell me, does the tune of chanting the Psalms change throughout the liturgical year, or is that just like a church's choice to change what it's chanted to?
That's a church's choice. It might be that particular psalms and tones are paired up. That's still an area I don't know super well myself. Here we use a simple chant tone, and it's the same one except for Lent. I would like to like maybe add another one in summer when we have fewer voices that's like all on one melody, but we don't change it week to week. It's pretty much the same thing week in, week out. And then in Lent, we use a different one.
Okay. So I'll have to look at this more, but I feel like it's changed not just Lent, and it doesn't change week to week. I know Lent was probably different, but I think there have been other ones too, and I know they do like summer choir differently. My only current complaint is that I'm just like not. I play music, and I feel like it still takes me a while to get the current chant that we do down. It like has 4 variations instead of 2. Okay. I'm not smart enough to keep up with it, but
yeah. I love chanting, but it is a learning curve. When I went to seminary, we would chant morning prayer. They had that like once a week maybe, but yeah, if they had the chant books out, you would see people walk up, see the chant books, and just not go to morning prayer, which seems a little counterproductive.
Does seem a little counterproductive.
Well, as we near the end of our time together, I know you shared with me that you conclude your interviews with a simple question I hope that all of us as Christians would be able to answer. What is the gospel? And in our pre-interview chat, you said this question hasn't been put to you yet. So to close this out, what is the gospel?
I love this question. I didn't even write it down, so I'm going to just kind of go off the top of my head here. But for me, the gospel is the good news that God took on flesh to heal humanity from the inside out, experiencing all of the worst of sin without sinning, that we might experience all the goodness of God. And I think the second part of that I would add is that this is really good news because we find that in Jesus, God looks like Jesus. He looks like someone that cares for the poor, the vulnerable, and that dies for the very creation that he gave life to, allows himself to die for them that they might have life. So the good news is that God heals us from the inside out by taking on flesh, and that God, the God of the universe, looks like Jesus. It is, in fact, is Jesus. So yeah, that's the good news of the gospel.
Amen. That's great. That's great.
Wonderful.
And I think St. Athanasius would high five you heartily over that answer as well.
Good. I've always wanted a high five from St. Athanasius, so life goal complete.
Austin, thanks again for your time. Any parting thoughts before we wrap up here?
No, I don't think so. This has been wonderful. Thanks for what you're doing on your channel. It's good to see some Episcopal voices on YouTube. Always glad to see that. And yeah, just keep up the good work. Thanks to everyone who's listened to this far through. And yeah, that's all I got.
Great. Thanks, Austin. And I'll have links to Austin's channel if somehow you have not heard of it. He has lots of really wonderful content. He's incredibly thoughtful. I really appreciate the tone and tenor you take of curiosity with your guests, because that's also what I'm hoping to embody in this channel as well. So I encourage you to keep up the really wonderful work you're doing, and that God will continue to bless you and your wife's journey as you follow along this way of Jesus.
Well, thank you so much.
All right. Take care. God bless.
God bless.